Hi, everybody. We really have a treat for you today, and that is Hollie McKay is going to be joining us from Kabul, Afghanistan. And we're so excited to speak to her. I was looking on the calendar and I realized that it's been nearly 2 months since our last live conversation with Hollie. She's been reporting from Afghanistan both before the Taliban took over and the United States withdrew, and then after. She has such a unique perspective because she's one of the few independent journalists that are still in the country right now. And so this is a real exciting moment to be able to talk to her live. So I having a few technical difficulties. What could go wrong? We're just trying to talk across continents, right? Live on Instagram. And we'll see if we can. There she is. It
Hi.
works. We have to have faith, Hollie, that it's going to work. It's a miracle.
You would think I would understand this technology by now, but I really don't. So
Well,
I'm still
it's
learning.
also, yeah, it's all
I'm
of
trying to
us,
get this right.
all of us. So, I mean, I'm so excited to see you. I haven't seen you. It's been
Oh
almost exactly 2 months, Hollie. We had our
my
last live
goodness.
together on August 15th. Can you believe it?
I know, that's crazy. Been the craziest 2 months. So that was the day that Kabul fell.
hmm
Wow.
And we didn't plan that. We kind of pulled together this live. We've been talking and trying to figure it out, what would make sense. And the time change is a little bit difficult. So you're 9.5 hours ahead of us here in Texas, Hollie.
Yes. Yes. That half hour confuses me every time.
Yes, and me too. And I was trying to explain I kind of popped on. I was talking to some of our followers on Smarter News. I mean, just learning these little fascinating bits from you has been so critical to getting a better understanding of the story in Afghanistan. But can you tell us, do you have electricity 24 hours a day in Kabul?
No, it's
So
been
tell us
real.
about that.
Well, so I'm trying to set this up and I'm having a lot of problems. I'm going to take my
It's okay.
headphones out and just do it without headphones so I can rest it against this. Okay. So right now the electricity, normally what happens is the electricity goes out around 5 a.m. and then it comes back on at around midday. But right now it's been literally going off at 5 a.m. and then not coming back on to maybe 1 or 2 and then going out again at around 7. And then maybe if you're lucky coming back on around midnight or 1. So the electricity situation has been really bad. And I heard that that was because one of the major suppliers had cut the electricity because they weren't getting their bills paid. But I also heard today that whatever quarrel that was is worked out. So hopefully it'll just go back to not having electricity in the morning, but the rest of the day, somewhat something going. So certainly
Well,
a
tell us, I
challenge.
mean, just give us some of just the little basics. Like what is the season there now? What is life like in the streets? Just what if you walk out your door, are you grabbing a jacket? I'm thinking about electricity because I'm thinking about heat, of course, as
Right.
well, and all of that. So what is life like in Kabul? If you were to walk out your door this morning, what do you see? What do you hear?
It
What is it like?
it turned really cold really quickly. So just really in the last week, it went from being really searing hot all day and all night to getting really cool in the morning to cool at night. It does still warm up a little bit during the day, but it's certainly, I've really noticed that shift in weather over the past week. So I actually had to go to the store and buy a jacket, which was, novel there's a bazaar they call it the Bush Bazaar, and it was named after George W. Bush. And it's sort of this dumping ground where people would take everything they could from the military bases, and they would just come in big boxes. I think a lot of it was really just stolen, and it was kind of like a lucky dip for the shop owners. So they didn't know what was in these boxes, but they'd bid on prices. And then they'd kind of get whatever was in there and they sell them at the shop. So you can sort of find kind of cheap American goods. And for any gun enthusiasts, you've got like really top-notch sites that would go for about $1,200 in the US that they sell for, like $100 at this bazaar, and like really old protein bars that are probably expired, and just a whole sort of bunch of, American camos and things like that are all stolen from bases that are sold there. So, yeah, so it was always called the Bush Bazaar, but yesterday when we went there, the Taliban was painting over it to call it, gosh, what were they calling it? Oh, the Mujahideen Bazaar. So they taking control of it.
So I mean, is it easy just to go out and buy a jacket if you need to? What are the
Yeah,
things that we've heard?
absolutely.
Oh, it is. Okay.
Absolutely. So, really, Kabul now is I know in the news a lot you see, you know, there's sort of the very hysterical side of things, and there's a lot of people that are obviously living in a lot of fear. There's obviously people that, and many, many people every day, dozens of people are still approaching me about how they can escape. But the reality, sort of just in the day-to-day streets, is that life kind of does goes on, and people are out again. You know, shops are pretty much all back opened. Traffic is a nightmare. So you're really sort of just seeing everybody kind of just have to get on with life. Really, there isn't much choice, and I certainly, in a kind of weird way, it's almost more secure now than it used to be. When I previously would come to Afghanistan, there was constant suicide bombings. You couldn't travel on the roads. It was very difficult, really, to go anywhere but Kabul, just because of the level of danger. And now, you know, and the level of danger was because the Taliban was really attacking constantly and had controlled a lot of those key checkpoints and roads and things. But now that they're in power, you know, that there's a lot more free reign to sort of travel. So I've been able to see a lot more of the country than I ever have before, and kind of walk around, I guess, without that sort of constant threat of, you know, a constant. You've got ISIS, of course, but beyond that, you don't have the same level of threats and concerns that that I have had previously. So it's this sort of ironic twist of fate, I guess.
Right. So that what was previously the main threat is now running the government. And
Yes.
so in a strange way, those attacks, those random attacks that were coming up against the Afghan government or the US, and you can explain this better, Holly, than I can, of course, is now centralized. It's centralized in a government. We had a question from one of our audience members. It was such a good one, which is, you know, how is Holly working? Like, how is she going all over the place? Is she allowed? We've heard we don't really know what life is like under the Taliban for women, and
Yeah.
certainly not an international journalist. So what
Yeah.
has that been like for you?
So I think, well, first of all, you have to go, everything's very permissions based. So there's a sort of a Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And so when I came back in, that's sort of the first place we went. And you have to get a letter from Mujahid's office, who is the spokesperson. And once they've approved your credentials and things, they sort of just give you this permission letter. I have it in my bag. I'll show it to you. Let me find it. So it's just this letter, and it kind of just says that I am working as an international. So see, so it's this. I carry this around. This is like my passport to life, and it basically is just stamped by their office, and I just carry this in my bag, and we pretty much. It's actually gotten a little bit more challenging now, but we pretty much sort of show that letter to the Taliban, and they, you know, have to basically give you permission to go anywhere, and that's sort of the golden ticket. Although, mind you, everywhere we go, it's sort of a fight between this command. Like you'll go to one place and you'll be with one, you know, Talibans will let you in, and then all of a sudden the Talibans come and two other convoys of Talibans come and they're yelling at you as to why you're here and why you didn't get permission from them. And there's a lot of infighting that's sort of happening, because really for them, they're trying to figure out this whole system too. But you know, I have a great sort of fixer, and he helps to sort of arrange meetings in advance, and there's not a great deal of coordination between all the different sort of district governors and other places that you sort of have to obtain permission to get access to certain places, or to get interviews. So it's a lot of just sitting around drinking tea, trying to convince people, making a lot of calls. But beyond that, I mean, the access is quite good, actually. I've certainly been able to sort of see a lot. So
Why do you
yeah,
think they're allowing you to see a lot? And I say allow, I mean, by the way,
yeah,
for those folks that are they're catching up, you were detained by the Taliban, and
yes,
there
was.
have been, and this just so tell us about that, and then also talk to us about, well, why would they not want to follow you everywhere and watch you do everything? It's
Right.
fascinating.
Yeah, I don't think they have the quite. They just don't really have the capacity to do that. And that's not to say they don't sort of keep an eye on you. I'm sure they probably do, but it's not. They don't really have the capacity or the technology to really do that in too much of an advanced way. I think they're very much trying to show that they're a different Taliban to what they were 20 years ago, and they sort of see the press as a key part of that. So honestly, I haven't sort of been restricted in any way, and I've certainly been very critical of the Taliban, and I haven't had any pushback from them by that. So hopefully that's a good sign that at least some sort of semblance of freedom of press exists, although I'm sure it's a lot more challenging for local journalists than it is for international journalists, who I think they fear a little bit more. But yeah, so the detainment happened. We were in Spin Boldak, which is a border town. It's in Kandahar and it borders Pakistan. And we were just sort of doing our job. And the unfortunate sort of thing is, anytime sort of the people there, and they were at the crossing and it was extremely busy and nobody was able to cross, and they see sort of a journalist, and you just sort of get mobbed. And there's just, the one minute I'd be talking to a local and the next minute just it was like hundreds of people had surrounded me, and it was certainly an uncomfortable situation that attracted the attention of the Taliban. And mind you, the day before, I had gone to the culture director at Kandahar, and he sort of said, you have permission to go wherever you want. So we didn't think it was going to be a problem. But I guess the border area had been classified as a military zone because there had been some skirmishes that had been happening there in the previous days. So it was unfortunate. And so our driver wasn't where he had left the car. And when we sort of tried to get back and escape, when the Taliban were coming after us, and we just couldn't find him. And so at the end, because the driver just wasn't there, they just sort of forced me into their police car. And then they took us to the police station, which was a little while away, and we sort of sat there for a while.
What's going through your mind? Because you're very good about telling these stories, by the way.
Yeah.
You're such an amazing storyteller. But like, in your mind, you're in this car. It's driven by the Taliban, very far away from Kabul, right on the border of Pakistan. This key area, Kandahar, is the birthplace of the Taliban. I mean, what is happening? What is happening? What is the narrative that's playing in your mind at this point?
Ooh, I lost you there for a second.
There you go. Okay, it's okay. It paused at the exact moment of a dramatic pause for us. So go. Okay.
Yeah. So I wasn't really too worried. I was pretty like, oh, well, I have permission to be here. Now everything is above board. I'm not concerned. And we sort of sat there for a while. But then more and more people started to come in. And even when we gave them all our credentials, they had my passport. They were able to see that I was stamped in. I was there legally. I had all the documentation that was required. And I gave them my press cards, and they still didn't believe it. They sort of looked at me and said, you're a spy. And I just said, I'm not. And they're like, this is all fake. And I was like, it's not all fake. I mean, I can sit here and argue with you about it, but I don't know what you want me to do. And so I got kind of quite uncomfortable, and the driver eventually came, and my fixer, and they're pretty good at sorting these sort of things out. And when they started to get worried, I thought, what, this is ridiculous, but this is obviously a legitimate concern. And so a lot of calls had to be made, and intel people came in and were sort of grilling us about who we were and what we did and why we were there. And then, it just took many, many hours. And then finally somebody from Mujahid's office, who is the sort of the foreign minister or in charge of the press, eventually, I guess, vouched for us and cleared our names. And then they were quite apologetic and ended up sort of giving us extra access to the border area than we wouldn't have got otherwise. But yeah, it was a little bit uncomfortable. I guess I figured it had to be resolved in one way or another, because we weren't doing anything wrong and we weren't there, illegally. But it's, again, you're always in, and that's always a threat for journalists, especially working in these foreign places. There tends to be conspiracy no matter where you work, whether it's the Middle East or Afghanistan. There's always this prevailing conspiracy that every journalist is a spy. And so it's really hard because you don't have a recourse to say, well, I'm not, so they have to take your word for it. And, sometimes that can, put you in a really precarious situation. So, it's just always something that you have to keep in the back of your mind and just kind of stay calm and go with it. I think if I panicked or I did something else, then they, that would have given them more reason to be concerned. So, yeah,
it's another one of we'll put that into your next book. Your experience on the ground in multiple war zones all over the world probably also has lent this sort of this way to keep yourself calm out of practice and discipline for your craft that not a lot of people have. And just listen to you talk about, oh, they thought that we were a spy. One of the important things to remember is when it comes to visibility on the ground. So let's say US officials, spies, whoever on the ground in Afghanistan, that's part of the big question about the withdrawal, is that we don't have visibility on the ground, that we're not there. You are, Hollie. And that's what I want people really to understand, how remarkable this is and your work is. And so tell us a little bit about what you saw, because most of what we're hearing from the news, if at all, about Afghanistan is just from Kabul. And you've been able to go a lot of different places. So what are you seeing across the country? What do you think everyone should know about what's happening in Afghanistan right now?
It's definitely sort of a holding period. So what I would say is that the sort of the rules and things haven't necessarily dramatically shifted from the previous government, and that is because the current government, the Taliban, have not formed a Gurja, which is sort of an Islamic group of scholars that come together and they decide what the laws are going to be and how things are going to be run and what punishments are going to be doled out for certain things. And they haven't come together yet because the Taliban fights with itself, and it's a lot of power struggle in that group. So until those laws are sort of solidified, it's this very strange holding period where you sort of live life in a way almost similar to the previous rule, with a little bit more stability, honestly. But until those laws are established, it's all just sort of a lot of conjecture. So even when it comes to something like women's dress, I'm still wearing what I wore previously, which is, I actually wear a man's Afghan dress that I had tailored. There's an amazing tailor across the street who, for literally $5, you can get the most beautiful Afghan dress. So I actually wear a man's Afghan dress, and then I just wear a hijab. But the Gurja may come together in 1 month, 2 months, 6 months, and decide that women have to wear an abaya or women have to wear a burqa. But right now, those decisions haven't been made yet. So I think it's this sort of strange holding period where we're all kind of waiting for that to happen, because when that happens, that is really going to determine the future of the country. And I think right now, what the Taliban is doing is they're trying to drum up international recognition. They're trying to get international support. So they're not willing to sort of do anything that's too drastic or too controversial, because they know that's not going to sort of get them, curry them favors with foreign governments. So it's sort of this strange time where we don't actually know what's going to happen, and we don't actually know what direction Afghanistan is going to go in, and really how different the Taliban rule is going to be from the 90s. They say that it's going to be different, but until we sort of see what laws they come up with, we really just don't know.
Can you explain the difference between a hijab, an abaya, and a burqa? Because even understanding the differences between those things will give us an idea of why the decision on those matters. And even something as simple as that will give us a different picture of Afghanistan someday.
Yeah. So the hijab is really just the headscarf that you use just to cover your head. And then you've got the abaya, which tends to be more worn in Iraq and under the Shia. And that's usually it's black and it's completely sort of covered dress that kind of comes, but your face is still exposed, but the rest of your body's not. And then you've got the niqab, which is where the material sort of, and you just see your eyes. So so everything's sort of covered but the eyes. And then you've got the burqa, which is just, fully, it's sort of this dress. It has a sort of a hat top that you put on, and then it's just layers of material and nylon covering around your eyes, and you don't see any of your face. And you have to sort of get that tailored correctly so that the mesh matches up to your eyes so that you can actually somewhat see. There's sort of the 4 main Islamic dresses.
Well, that's really important, because when you see people in pictures from Afghanistan, it gives you a certain picture of the country, or really anywhere in the Middle East or elsewhere that would use this sort of dress. And in the images of Afghanistan prior to the U.S. involvement, we saw full burqas. We saw some of that come. You were wearing one as well when the Taliban eventually took over while you were in Mazar Sharif, which we could talk a little bit about. But now the images that we're seeing in Afghanistan, and even you walking around, again, these are just pictures, but they matter of the story that the country is trying to tell. And so do you have any thoughts about when you could see that council come together? Like, when do you think it could be is it a total waiting game right now?
It's a really, and I ask this all the time, Jenna, and even yesterday I was back at the Vice and Virtue Ministry, and I ask again, when is this happening? And all I get told is very soon, very soon. It's going to happen very soon, but nobody is willing to give any sort of timeline on that.
Do they know you now, Holly? Are they like, hey, Holly, back in
Yeah,
Vice and
well,
Virtue?
good luck if they try to even look at me or acknowledge me. So I've
Because
actually
you're a woman, right? They don't.
right. So I've actually been doing a bit of a social experiment with it because, for the first sort of month or so, I was very sort of just feeling out the situation, I guess. And so I'd go into an interview situation or walk into sort of any ministry really, and I would just sort of wait and stand in the back because I knew that they weren't going to acknowledge me or greet me in any way. And I was with, my photographer and fixer who would always be greeted. There's a lot of very, male greetings. They're sort of a very big deal. And I would sort of just wait in the background and just kind of sit there until I was ready to ask questions. Because that's sort of just the way that the Taliban does it in their very stringent Islamic code. But I guess I got a little bit fed up with it, and I had to question what role I can play sort of as a foreign woman. Do I sort of accept the cultural norm of that, or do I try to push against it? Like, where is that appropriate balance? Because you obviously want to be respectful of culture and different people's way of seeing things, but at the same time, I also don't want to play into sort of that narrative of normalizing that treatment of women. So I've just completely changed tactics now. I literally march up and I stare at them. It's like a staring competition. I stare at them and I stare at them, and I know even if they're not looking at me, they know that I'm staring at them. And 90% of the time they break and end up looking at me and acknowledging me in some way. We were at the park last Friday, which is the weekend day off, and it's an amusement park and it's got rides and things. And it was all just Taliban there when we went. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to go on a ride. So I get on this sort of, I don't know what you call it, this spinning ride that goes up. And I'm sitting there waiting for it to go up. And there's just this crowd of Taliban around. They'd just never seen a woman go on a ride before. And I just stood there and I waved at them. And they just did not know what to do. And I thought, I just need, in some way, show that somehow you need to acknowledge me, because women are here, women are working, women are somehow, they're here to stay. And I don't want to play into sort of the narrative of being the invisible person. And even if it makes them very uncomfortable, which I know it does, because I get right in their face, they're just gonna have to deal with it. And I think for a lot of them too, especially the foot soldiers, they've never really seen a woman before. Even if they're married, their wives are at home, and their wives will generally not leave the house again until they're of old age. So they've spent the better part of the last 20 years fighting in the mountains. So for them, this is just, they don't know what to do with me either. So I think everybody's kind of learning right now. I'm learning how to interact in a very new world. They're learning how to interact in a very new world. And it's just this sort of large, strange social experiment. But in doing that so far, I haven't had any sort of negative pushback to it. I haven't, experienced, anything that's sort of too bad. I get, probably questioned a little bit, and I think most of them would prefer to be doing an interview with a man. But yeah, I just think it's sort of an opportunity just to at least make them realize that women exist and that we're not going to just stand in the background anymore. So yeah,
what is your understanding of what life's like for a female journalist in Kabul? Are they still reporting? Are they still working?
There are some, obviously nowhere near as many as there were before, but there are certainly some incredibly brave women working for Tolo and some local channels. I'm sure it's extremely challenging for them, but they are still out and doing their jobs and trying to, interview Taliban, interview other people. It's a very difficult time though, because I think the Taliban is being very heavy-handed with local media and what they can do. And obviously there isn't really the entertainment programs anymore. There isn't sort of a lot of what was invested really in the last 20 years that no longer exists. But I think, yeah, the Taliban is sort of trying to exert as much control as they can over the local media, but they're fairly aware that they don't have the capacity or the power to do that with the foreign media. So there certainly is a divide there.
Tolo News is the only 24-hour news station in Afghanistan, and it was really interesting to watch the growth of this particular network. And so that's where actually I look a lot on their social media to see what they're reporting on. I saw a woman that was reporting on a story about girls going to school, and I wanted to ask you a little bit on your reporting on that, Hollie, because as you were reporting on it, we also got word from the United States government that there's this meeting that took place between the Taliban and U.S. representatives. And you talked a little bit about the dance here, about money. And we can kind of tie it full circle to waiting out news from this council and what's going on with the international community. And really what's at stake here is not just recognition for the Taliban, if they even want that from the international community, but there's money. There's a lot of money at stake. Can you just talk to us a little bit about that and how that kind of ties into a lot of these stories?
So when the Taliban took control in August 15, the U.S. Froze $9.4 billion in funds that was supposed to go to the Afghan government. So in some ways, that is the Afghan government's money, but that was coming from the U.S. and that was frozen. And of course, the IMF, International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank also froze, and the UN and a lot of the major NGOs all sort of departed. And so I guess the Taliban were really relying on that money to govern a country, and they don't have any money. And mind you, the Taliban soldiers, they don't get paid. They have not been paid for 20 years. They've been fighting for their cause. They have not been fighting for any form of salary. So for them, they're sort of fairly used to existing off not that much. But to run a country, it's a very different situation. So the economic situation is extremely dire. And when it comes to girls' education, what the Taliban did was they stopped. So primary school went back, but the secondary school, high school, is where they stopped the education. And the reason that they give for that is that because they believe that, not only do girls have to be in separate classrooms, which for the most part, girls had separate classrooms anyway, so that wasn't going to really change. And then they were using the excuse of, well, we need to sort out transport. We can't have girls walking to school or anyway interacting with boys. They have to be in separate buses, and we have to organize all this infrastructure first before that they can go back. And then they were sort of saying, well, we can't do this infrastructure. We can't have the buses or the cars until we get this money. We don't have the money for that. So they were sort of playing this tit for tat game with it. And then also at the same time saying, well, we don't necessarily need the government to come back. We just need NGOs because we want to do things on our terms. So their concern was that even if the money was unfrozen, that they were going to be told that they had to do things a certain way. And they can't be seen to their base as in any way, I guess, cowering to what a foreign government is telling them to do, because that has been the center point to their ideology over the years, is that Afghanistan must be independent. We cannot have any foreign invaders in our country. And so for them to sort of make any concessions, that would be very frowned upon by their foot soldiers. And one very high-ranking Taliban intelligence official actually said, there are all these points that the Western governments, that the US wants us to do, and that's, girls' education and certain things that are perhaps how we see human rights, but aren't necessarily compatible with the way they see Islamic rights. And he said, if we do these things, our entire rank and file is going to go and join ISIS. So we can't sort of risk that. So they've sort of created a very much a double-edged sword here by very stringent indoctrination of their soldiers, often in these madrasas. And now they're trying to play this game of, we need the money and we want international recognition. But at the same time, if we don't have this very strict version of Islamic law, then we're going to risk a very disillusioned rank and file who are then going to go to something even more extreme, which would then be ISIS. And that would just sort of create a huge problem, not only for Afghanistan, but really for the world.
So what is the possibility of money actually flowing to the Taliban? And I ask this question as we have a lot of US taxpayers that are going to be listening to this conversation. do you see a scenario right now where, well, those funds could be unfrozen? And do you have any sort of insight that you could share about if taxpayer money eventually did go to Afghanistan in the form of humanitarian relief, which is how the State Department is talking about it? Oh, it wouldn't be to the government, it would be for humanitarian relief. Is that possible, that it would actually go to humanitarian relief and not to the Taliban?
I don't see, well, here's one sort of silver lining I see in it is that the Taliban knows that people are hungry, people can't feed their family, people can't get just sort of the basic economic support anymore. And I think the Taliban is very aware that if they're, the common people, so to speak, can't meet their basic needs, then they are going to, they're going to at some point rise up against them. So I think the Taliban is sort of somewhat aware of that, which gives me confidence in the sense that I think that at least something would go to people in need. Obviously, it's debatable how much and to what. But also the Taliban has very much, I guess, marketed itself as ridding the corruption that existed under the previous government. So if it was to, and certainly, when people see money, and they certainly haven't really been exposed to that much money, and before goodness knows what's going to happen in terms of their own corruption. Yeah. But they've built this entire case of really gaining the support of Afghan people, even people that hated the Taliban before. Just got so fed up with the level of corruption, Jenna. The level of corruption that was enabled under the past 20 years is just absolutely mind-blowing. And to me, like, if you were to ask me, why did the US not succeed in Afghanistan? And my answer, first and foremost, would be, we turned a blind eye to the corruption. We basically created this incredible cash cow that the regular Afghan people never saw any benefit from. And we can completely go into that debate, because it's something that I'm, extremely angered by every single day when I see how that's played out in this country. So the Taliban has sort of marketed itself on ridding that. So that sort of gives me some hope in that some relief may happen. But again, it's just this very difficult situation, because this is a group that was an insurgency that has killed just countless people and detonated countless suicide bombs, and has just done the most brutal attacks over the past 20 years. And now to sort of have to look at them as a government, it's a difficult sort of situation to try and reconcile. But I also don't see a situation where the Taliban is really going to agree for foreign countries to release money or to distribute aid without their absolute oversee, or them taking charge of that situation as the government. So it's a very difficult diplomatic dance, and I don't necessarily see that much of a way around it, really, unless more NGOs come back and are able to see the funding the way that they want to see it. But regardless of that, the Taliban, as the government, is going to want to have control and see that things are done on their terms. So it's a really difficult situation.
Well, what you're describing is actually what the top military leaders in America also described during recent testimony in front of Congress, that they underestimated the corruption, that the corruption was so rampant, and that was a major factor. So interesting to hear it from two different perspectives. One of the other things that was a big news here in the United States, and I'm wondering how much you can speak to it, Holly, is, obviously there's a lot of talk about the Taliban harboring, supporting, being linked to terrorists like Al-Qaeda. And I just what do you hear about that in Afghanistan? Do you hear the term Al-Qaeda? Is anyone talking about Al-Qaeda?
Yeah.
You were in
I bring it up. Yeah.
I bring it up about that.
Yeah, I bring it up a fair bit when I'm speaking to military officials and things. And, that they're actually being very well media trained, because they're always, they'll give me this sort of sly smile of like, I'm not going to answer that. But what I have heard is that Al-Qaeda exists, but what they've been told is that they're not allowed to make any military movements, and that, apparently sort of a lot of the areas, which tend to be Pakistan border areas where Al-Qaeda exists, they're there, families are living there, and certainly operational, but I am told that they've been warned, at least for now, that they're not allowed to sort of take any military action. And if they do try to take military action, the Taliban is going to sort of revolt against them. So that's sort of been the consensus that I've heard when it comes to Al-Qaeda. So they're certainly around, but right now they're being told that they need to lay low and stay inside. So we'll see how long that plays out. Again, that could just be a ploy until they get the international recognition. We really just don't know. But certainly they exist.
Mm-hmm. What do you think is the possibility at this point of, and I know there's so much unknown, I want to respect what you're saying about that, because we often are in the rush to like report the story before it's done. And sometimes this timeline may be a couple of years, but the reason that the America was in Afghanistan was that we did not want it to become a safe haven for terrorists. We don't want to see history repeating itself. And so is there anything that you look at as you're examining that question that you say, okay, this is going to be helpful? I don't want to say predicting that or getting an understanding of that. You've done a lot of reporting over the years on ISIS in Syria and beyond. We know ISIS in Afghanistan. How, if a military member from America called you and so what do you think is the situation on the ground? What should we be watching? What would you say to them?
I would say the biggest cause for concern in terms of conflict is a schism within the Taliban itself. So really the Taliban was formed out of infighting with the Mujahideen. So the Mujahideen was backed by the United States to fight the Soviet invasion in the 80s and 90s. And then once they'd sort of been successful and the Soviets left, there was just such a massive sort of vacuum of power within this group. And so eventually the Taliban sort of splintered off from this larger Mujahideen group that were a lot more united. And so you had Mullah Omar in 1994, just from a little mosque in Kandahar, basically preached this idea of people coming together to sort of fight the invaders. And then you sort of had this entire splinter movement. And ISIS-K, which is the ISIS affiliate in Afghanistan, that's also a splinter movement from the Taliban. That came from disaffected leaders in the Taliban who then decided to splinter off because they didn't agree or they wanted more power and sort of pledge allegiance to Baghdadi. So what you see is this sort of evolution with all these groups of them eventually splintering off, and it comes down to it's sort of inability to, or this power play. And I think we're really, really seeing that. And this is probably a key reason why the full government hasn't been formed, is because different factions of the Taliban want more power and they want different things. So you sort of have the Haqqanis, for example, that want to control certain things. And they're very much sort of on a very, from what I'm hearing, say Siraj Haqqani, who is obviously a wanted terrorist by the United States, but he is the Minister of Interior, which means he's in charge of the internal security in Afghanistan, he is quite at odds with Mullah Omar's son, Mullah Yaqub, who is the in charge of the military. So he's the Minister of Defense. So you have these massive power plays going on behind the scenes. And to me, that is the biggest cause for concern, because history just tells us when these groups decide to splinter and start new groups, that's when you have a civil war. And Afghanistan saw that in the 90s. So that is something I think really is something that needs to be watched. And I think that's why Qatar and China and Pakistan and foreign sort of countries within the region are trying to sort of get involved to avoid that happening to some degree. But I think, that would be my biggest cause for concern, is what is going to happen to all these people that have never really been able to govern before, and now they have to govern, and everybody wants more power than the other. So that's definitely what I would say is the thing to watch.
Fascinating. That's something that we're not hearing a lot about here at all. So that's really important to pay close attention to. One of the things that we've talked about, I'd love you to take folks behind the scenes in your own reporting, Hollie, that one of the things we've discussed is that there can be, I think we talked about at the beginning here, kind of hysteria, right, of the Taliban taking over, and obviously there's a lot of reason for concern about that. It's rightful hysteria in a lot of ways, but then you also have the reality on the ground, and at times you felt torn between accurate reporting and not wanting to appear as an apologist for the Taliban, and because you're one of the few people there that can actually say this is what I'm seeing, it puts you in this tension, right? Because some people, how can you say that? How can it be more stable under the Taliban? How can you say
Right.
that about that group? Talk to us a
Yeah.
little bit about that challenge as a journalist. I think even just hearing that gives us a different way to consume the news that
Yeah.
we're also going to be hearing.
Yeah, and I think too, if I was sort of solely just relying on what I saw on Twitter or what I saw in a lot of the news, which is obviously highlighting a lot of the terrible abuses that are happening, I guess my impression, if I wasn't here, would just be that it was absolute sort of chaos and slaughter in the streets. And coming here, I didn't quite know what to expect, and sort of what I found was that a lot of the incidences of being hunted down, being sort of taken out, not to say they're not happening, but they're certainly the exception, not the norm. For the most part, Afghans just want to get on with life. They want to just, however they can, make money. They want to feed their families. They want to just somehow survive. I'm sure majority of them still would love to leave the country, but for the ones that know that that's not really a possibility right now, it's just about getting on with life. So I found that sort of a lot of the hysteria and things that I was reading or seeing in the news just did not match reality. And I did a story on this, really looking at to a lot of the misinformation that was happening and being retweeted. I'll give you an example. There was a picture that was going around of a woman in a burqa, and she was standing sort of behind a man walking down the street. Anyway, it turned out when I looked into that picture, the picture was from Iraq in 2003, and someone had actually photoshopped a chain to her foot to say this was what was happening in Afghanistan. And that's just one example of many. And there's so many of these examples that I really just had to trace where a lot of them were coming from, and they weren't even really coming from inside the country. They were coming from, people meddling outside the country into different effects. So I think that's really important to highlight. And for me, when I sort of tried to highlight a lot of these things like the misinformation, or really just present what I was seeing on the ground, it was, would unleash the absolute trolls, and it was very confronting. And I would get threats and all sorts of abuse just because I wasn't, I guess, going hook, line, and sinker with a narrative that was being pushed often by other governments. And so I just think it's important as a journalist to report what you see and hear. And I'm certainly not the authority. I can't be in every place at one time. But I think it's important to go in with an open and clear mind and to sort of report exactly what you see. And it's certainly in a time when, people's lives are under threat. And I certainly don't want to diminish that in any way, because that certainly exists. And I know that my place as a foreigner is very different to locals. But I just also think it's important to be accurate. And that's all we can be as journalists. It's about reporting and showing what you see and hear, and always looking at things with a critical eye. And yeah, it was probably my first real experience in having to deal with just so much hate for trying to report the truth. And that was, at first, it was just, it was very puzzling and difficult for me to kind of wrap my head around.
For sure. Well, you have a lot of support as you're speaking from our live audience that's listening to you on this. And this is something that we talk about at Smarter News too, which is that we can hold multiple ideas together at one time, and the audience can. And one of the things that I see in the media at times is not a respect for the audience to handle a lot of dynamics. We handle a lot of dynamics in our life, and I think you've been very clear that this can be an extremely dangerous and fraught and scary time. And also you can see stability walking down a street, and those things can be true at one time, and it can be confusing. But if you don't report all of it, then we can't get a more accurate picture. And so I think, I admire your work so much, Hollie, and it's so exciting to see you do such good work at such a critical time in history. What's next for you right now? You've been in Afghanistan, let's see, more than 2 months now, almost 3 months. What's your plan? How do you see your work continuing there? And what questions do you have left to ask?
I think I really still want to stay a little bit longer to really see the way things play out. I plan, I've been traveling a lot, and next week, hopefully we plan to see a lot more of the untapped areas of the country. And also there's some work I really want to look into in terms of the ISIS, the Daesh threat, which tends to come from Nangarhar province. So hopefully we'll go there next week to sort of look into that a little bit more. And then the sort of really untapped areas of Kurungul Valley and Nuristan that you've never been able to reach by road. So that is sort of what we're figuring out now logistically, just how sort of safe that is, because, even, I was even hearing from some inside reports that the Taliban were robbed at checkpoints there. So there's obviously some security concerns there. So we're just trying to navigate that, but that's somewhere that I would really just like to see. I think that would be really special. Yesterday I was in Logar province again, and in an incredible, first time you could ever access it. It was called Mazainak, and it's literally has the largest copper deposits in the world. And the Chinese actually signed a 30-year deal to lease that mine back in 2008, but weren't really able to develop it because it also holds the most incredible archaeological sites. So you've got Buddhas from the 5th century, really. You've got Zoroastrian temples. So you see, it was just incredible. You walking through, and I was just sort of seeing these incredibly, half excavated things from history. And so you sort of, and I guess my concern with that is that, the China's already planning to come back in. What is going to happen to these archaeological sites that are just so important? And a question I get asked a lot is, well, what is the Taliban doing to these archaeological sites? And I always say, well, right now they're guarding them. And I also, I went to Ghazni a few weeks ago, and same thing there. There's incredible history there, but right now the Taliban is guarding it and safeguarding it. And I know that's sort of not the narrative again that people are hearing. Everybody's sort of hearing, oh my goodness, the Taliban's going to blow this up, and right now they are making very extended efforts to make sure that nobody's going in there and nobody's touching or ruining anything. But having said that, if you look at the previous reign of the Taliban, it took them 5 years before they decided to blow up the Buddhas of Bamiyan, which was a devastating moment for a lot of people, and that happened in March of 2001. So that was, you're almost 6 years into a Taliban rule when Mullah Omar declared that. So right now, it seems that these things are being kept, and I talked to archaeologists that were working, in the Taliban ministry department there, who were certainly keen to get back to work there. But yeah, we as an international community have to show the value of these things, and we also have to, put pressure on the Taliban to make sure they continue to safeguard these things. And it's going to be interesting what happens with the mining there, because if you also look 20 years ago when the US went into Afghanistan, we didn't have an iPhone. Tesla wasn't a company. So really the sort of the copper and the lithium, it wasn't that valuable. And today it's worth probably anywhere between $1 and $3 trillion. And the China has sort of prime, pickings for that. So it's certainly going to be interesting as the Taliban tries to figure out its financial situation and who it's sort of going to let in, and what is going to happen from there. And there are things that, even though they may not be headline news, they may not be sort of sexy things to necessarily write about. I guess I've switched more into, instead of a day-to-day news sort of modality, it's more looking at feature and long-term projects now, where I can really document these things, because I do think they're important, and I do think people, want to hear about them.
I couldn't agree more. And what you just said about the copper mines and lithium and all of that valuable resources that's been talked about for years in Afghanistan, what could happen to that, how that could change the fate of Afghanistan, what international partnerships could come. I mean, it's really an amazing story. I encourage everybody, I know most people already follow you on Instagram, but clearly you've posted some incredible pictures. You have your own Substack so people can read your newsletter, what personal reflections you put out. You also have a book. I hope I say this correctly, Hollie. It's Only Cry for the Living. Is the correct? It's such like and if you see the cover of the book, I mean, just amazing work that you talk about your reporting beyond Afghanistan. So it's a real treasure. What a person said here, be safe. We so appreciate you. And I couldn't echo that more. Like, be safe. We think about you. I worry about you like a mother all the time. I just want to tell you that.
Thank you.
I do, but I'm going to remain calm and be able to, we're going to do the best reporting out there in journalism that's out there. And you're doing it, Hollie. So thank you so much. I hope that, I know we had some questions. Unfortunately, we got to run, but hopefully after you kind of figure out your next steps, I'd love to do another live with you again, and we can talk about what you've seen and all that's developed, because it is a quickly developing story. So I hope that that's possible. But Hollie, thank you so much.
Yeah, I love answering people's questions, and sometimes, you know, people pose really just the most amazing questions I've never thought of, and I thought that's a really brilliant insight. So it's useful to me too. So I'd love to.
Okay, great. All right, guys, we're gonna have to leave it there. Holly, so great to see you. Hopefully you'll get to sleep because it's way past your bedtime. No, it's probably not.
Yeah.
You're fine.
Yeah, I'm actually going to be up again at 1 o'clock in the morning. So
Oh, for
I'll
another
try to get
interview.
a
I'm
cat
sorry.
nap.
Okay. Well, it's great to see you. It's wonderful to see you in person, and I look forward to the next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your support, Jenna. It's appreciated.
All right, and thank you all at Smarter News. All right, guys, I'm going to save this, post it, and keep your questions and comments coming.
Bye.